Hi there, this video is going to discuss the idea of mitigating your liabilities whilst in running. This follows on from a question that was raised on the channel last week about trading out for a guaranteed loss. It got me thinking over the past few days as to what ways or mechanisms you can use to reduce liabilities on runners whilst carrying on and allowing you to trade in running. First of all, let me just rattle off a few thoughts that are in my head, and then we'll discuss them in more detail later on. So the first thing that you could do is a bit of pre-race trading if you've got any skills at that. If you can green up across the field before you go and place your Dutch with a view to trading out in running, you can certainly do that. During in running, you can manually trade out at some point, predetermined point in the race, halfway through, for example, irrespective of what your profit and loss is. Similarly, you can do the same sort of thing if the market profit and loss hits a predetermined stop loss point. That was essentially the question that was posted on the channel the other week. You could manually trade out if you think one of your selections in your Dutch is running poorly and won't do the business for you. You can trade out individually on that one, thereby saving some of the money from the stake that you had on that runner. You could potentially nibble away at the liabilities on the other runners that are not involved in your Dutch by using the in-running scalping technique. Again, that's been demonstrated in numerous videos in the past. You could place small lays at ever decreasing odds in the market prior to the race going and running. You can actually do it in running as well, of course, but you can do it prior to the race going and running, so that as the odds on your selections reduce, those individual small lays are scooped up, and the corresponding liability on all the other runners is subsequently reduced. You could potentially use the Dutch skewing technique to provide some insurance on runners that you don't particularly fancy, but you may be worried about a bit. That can certainly be something you can look at. And another technique which really only works or potentially works with races where there are the outsiders have pretty high odds, is you could actually take a small portion of your overall stake that you intend to use for the race and place a small Dutch on those outsiders, so that when you do place your main Dutch with the remainder of the money, the liability on those outsiders is somewhat reduced. You'll still end up with a liability on some of the horses, so that may not necessarily be an option. So there's a number of things that have been rattling around in my head over the past few days that you might want to try. So let's explore some of those in more detail. So I've got the 7:30 race at Dundalk opened. Now, I haven't actually analysed this race. I haven't looked at anything with regard to the form or anything like that. We'll just pop in some numbers. So what I'll do first of all is go into simulation mode, because I don't want real bets going into the market as I chop and change things. Okay, just let's have a look at some of these options. The Dutch skewing technique that I showed you the other day, may as well just bring this up again. So let's just imagine, for the sake of argument, that our two favourite runners that we're going to Dutch during the race are the top two in the market, but there may be some others that you're interested in that are worried about, that you're not sure of. First of all, we need to put on variable profit, and what we can do is by reducing those to zero, or alternatively what you can do is bump these numbers up a bit, and what that does is starts to redistribute your overall stake of 100 in a different way. So for example, on this one here, you'll see that you've got an overall profit of 127 on the favourite, slightly less on the next favourite, and then your three runners that you're worried about, although you don't particularly fancy, you have a small stakes going on, so you'll get a return of 0, 0 and £21 if you were to let this Dutch run to its conclusion. So that might help to eliminate something. And the thing it does there is that it reduces the number of runners that you have the full liability on. So you've got less runners to worry about. You still have a liability though, so you may not necessarily want to try that technique, or you may need to also employ another technique to help minimize that £100 on those other runners. But it's certainly something that you might want to consider. So that's one thing. The other thing, although this race isn't particularly suited to it, but we might as well have a wee look while we're here, on the outsiders. So we've got, let's see, the bottom 4 there are reasonably high. So if you were to select each of those, now if we were to take an overall stake for the race of 100, let's just cut that down to 90. So if we put £10 on those outsiders, you'll see that we end up with £163 on the bottom 4. Okay, so if we were then to select our, actually I need to cancel those first. So keeping that in mind, 164 on those runners. So we now have the remainder available for the rest of our Dutch. So we've got £90 to play with. So if we put the £90 on those, you'll see that we have £204 or £200 available there. Now that 164 that was on the bottom 4, the return is obviously going to be reduced by that £90 there. So we're looking at in the order of £70 sitting on those outsiders. You'll still end up with £100 on all the others, so you still have a liability there. As I say, this tends to work if the odds of the outsiders were that much higher. Again, you can reduce the amount of share of the stake that they have on them. So typically for races like novice races and maidens, it can potentially work quite well. But you generally find that you will have at least 1 or 2 runners that still have the full liability on them. So you need to keep that in mind. But that's something you could perhaps do. You may actually be able to do much the same sort of thing rather than splitting your stake, is to play around with the skewing technique to essentially achieve the same ends. But that's one thing that you can actually do there. Next we can do the end running technique. So if I just cancel out of this, actually fine, let me just submit that so that we have £200 on there, presumably our 2 selections for this exercise. With the end running scalping technique, what you would do is you would place scalp trades in running, but only on the 2 runners or the number of runners that you have your Dutch on. So what you want to do is end up reducing this level here. In actual fact, let me just increase the Dutch, or put in a second Dutch just to cover the so that we actually got £100, so that we're always comparing the same amount of money. So we'll just submit that in there. Okay, so what we've got here is £223 on each of these runners if you were to let the Dutch run to its conclusion. What we want to do is use the end running scalping technique to nibble away at this minus 100. Okay, so what you do is make sure this liabilities option is switched on, change that to a figure that's less than the 200. Typically in that sort of thing you would probably look at 180 to 200. So let's put in 200 here. Okay, so what will happen is, imagine that we are now in running. You would set up your trading option, switch that on so that it's an offset of anything from 3 to even as much as 10 ticks. The larger the number of ticks, the less scalping that you'll be able to do in any one particular race. And this is particularly true when you're doing a long race. This is a 6 furlong scalp, so this particular technique may not necessarily work that well. Although having said that, over the 6 furlongs, the volatility will be greater, generally speaking. So 6 of one and half a dozen of another. Essentially what you do is, once the race is in running, you place in a scalp, an opening trade on each of these, and that'll take away and disappear. Actually, it just so happens that one of them's been taken. Right, so in this particular example, there's only a small amount of money being taken on this one here, but essentially what happens is, if the whole stake is taken, you'll end up with the figure here, the £230 or whatever it was, will be reduced by the liability of the lay. The important thing is, and it's why we set this figure here less than that figure there, is that if that lay is taken and that horse continues to shorten and never drifts, your scalp will never be matched, but you've already got money sitting on it, so if it went on to win, you're still in profit. And that's why you set that figure less than the money that's already on the horse. And that's also why you only do this on the horses that have been involved in the Dutch. So you can keep doing that, and what you'll find, particularly over a longer race, you should be able to reduce the overall figure here from minus £100 in this particular example. You should be able to reduce it by at least £5, £10, and even £15 if you're fortunate enough that the race has been relatively volatile. And so you would do that on every one of your horses. So that's the in-running technique, and that can work out reasonably well. Another option available to you, again, let me just let me think. Let's just clear out of that so that we've got refresh. So let's redo that, and we'll set that back to 100. Keep in mind that we've actually got a little loss of 30p there, so the odds will be slightly different. Yeah. So submit that. What you can do is place smaller bets in running. Now that I look at that, actually it'll be clearer if I do that again. Start from the beginning. So I'll set switch off simulation mode just to clear the figures and switch it back on again. So what we can do is place lower small stakes, small lays at ever decreasing odds. So let's first of all set up the Dutch. And if we go to the ladder, it's easier to see in the ladder. I need to switch off training and autofill here, and we need to change that to a smaller figure. So first of all, you'd look at these stakes here, and actually there's two ways of doing this. First of all, consider the stake on Woodrow, £55 near enough. If Woodrow was to run very badly and its odds shot out right at the end, right at the beginning of the race I should say, Tawazon, I presume that's how you pronounce that, Tawazon would need to recover that £55. So what you can do is place a lay in running where Tawazon, if it hit £3.25 I should say in running, it would be low enough to recover the losses on the other horse. So similarly with Woodrow, you do the same sort of thing. You'd be looking at recovering £45. So again, we need to scroll down here, £45 and 45 pence. So you'd be looking at, so you see you actually have either horse has to trade more or less around at the same point. Okay, so if either of those horses falls out the stalls and the other one runs well, it needs to run all the way down to 3.25 in order to recover the losses caused by the other runner, and that's just to get to a scratch trade effectively. If you want a profit, it obviously needs to trade a bit lower than that. However, generally speaking, one of those horses won't necessarily fall out the stalls. It will hopefully still be running reasonably well as well, and so putting a trade down there may be more than you need to do. Okay, so another option that you can do, instead of doing that, we can place smaller trades at ever decreasing odds. So we've got 55 and 45 pounds. So you could put in, let's say, small lays of 10 pounds each. So make sure you have the liability option switched off. Change that to 10, and then just scroll down. Let me just pop that up a bit so you can see more of the ladder, and then you would just put in some lays in running like so, and you do that on each horse. So irrespective of which horse, and generally speaking, you would put in perhaps 6 lays on Woodrow and 5 lays on Tawazon to get you that money recovered. So as each of those horses reduces in odds, it will scoop up those lay bets that are sitting there and just gradually decrease the liability on the other horses. And I see one of those has just been taken without being actually in running. I should do this more often. I'll make me actually better at pre-race trading. Not. So you can see there what's happened there is one of those bets has been taken on Tawazon, so it's automatically reduced the liability to £90. So that's the whole idea, but generally, obviously this would happen in running. I'm a good 10 minutes out here from the start of the race, but that's generally speaking what you would do. And the idea is that you would group these together, not necessarily too close together, otherwise you'll reduce your effectiveness of being able to trade out for a decent profit. But again, similarly, you don't necessarily want to go too low, otherwise those lays may never get matched. So it's something you just play around with. Generally speaking, I wouldn't separate the lays by more than 10 ticks. And I wouldn't necessarily start them off from less than 20 ticks, sorry, more than 20 ticks below your entry point for the Dutch, if you follow me. Okay, so that's another technique you can use, and that will slowly but surely reduce your liabilities in running. The other thing about that, as soon as you start laying off like that, you'll generally find that you have to let the race run a bit longer in order to reach your target profit and then be able to trade out for an overall profit, as your liability is nibbled away at using that technique. Okay, once again, let me just switch simulation mode on and off again, just to clear the numbers. And if we go back to the grid again, what other options have you available to you? Well, let's again just set up our Dutch on the top two. So, as the race progresses, obviously these odds will change and that number at the top will change. So you can wait till halfway through the race and green up or red up, depending on what the figure is, keeping in mind that more often than not, if you red up for the whole market, it's incredible how often it works out that the runners that you selected in your Dutch, one of them will do well enough for you to have met your target profit, but it's too late then if you've already readied up, which is why I advise you don't do that. If you're worried about your red getting too big, I suggest you reduce your stakes and just let the race run through to its conclusion. And if your trade out point, your profit trade out point isn't met, it's effectively the same as you reading up at the same level when you used a higher stake at the beginning. The other option that you might find useful, particularly if you're watching the race, is if you think one of your runners isn't running particularly well, you can trade out individually on that. Okay, so for example, you can see here, again, we're obviously not in running at the moment, but with £51 on, if we think that Woodrow isn't looking the business, he's sitting at minus 47 just now. If we just trade out of him, our liability now drops down. So we've lost whatever it was, £5 on him, added on to the £48 that we still have sitting on Tawazon. So our liability now is 53. So if you think one of your runners is not doing particularly well, you can at any time during the race trade out on that runner. However, keep in mind the possibility of that horse picking up again and charging through the field and getting you into what would have been a profitable position. But at least using this mechanism, rather than trading out of the whole field, the whole of the Dutch, you still have a runner that's fighting your corner for you, and he may well win and get you into your profit position. And I think that's it. Oh no, so the pre-race trading. If you're any good or even semi-good at pre-race trading, that's something that you might want to consider. If you're able to green up even just £5 before the race, and let's say you were using £100 stakes for your Dutch, right away there you've saved £5 on it, so your liability will now be £95 when you enter the Dutch. And if you're looking for a let's say a profit of £20 greened up in running, well, you're already 25% of the way there. And so your automatic strategy, if you're using one, it'll get triggered sooner compared to if you didn't have that £5 head start. So if you have any skills at pre-race trading, that may well be something that you might want to look at. Keep in mind, however, that there will be situations where you aren't able to green up pre-race and instead you red up pre-race. So taking that same example, this time you have a minus £5 going into your Dutch, so your liability would be £105. So in that situation I wouldn't use a £100 stake. Instead I would change my Dutch to a £95 Dutch, and so my liability would be £100. Now in that situation you've got your Dutch has to work a little bit harder to achieve your £20 profit target. You can leave that as it is, or alternatively what you could do is slightly reduce your target profit for that particular race. So you might want to reduce it to 15 or 10 and do it that way. But certainly if you've got any skills pre-race, that it's well worth doing. I won't bother trying to demonstrate that because my pre-race trading is utterly hopeless. Even after 14 years of playing around in this game, I've never been very good at the pre-race trading. But if you are, by all means use that as well. And certainly in the long run, although a £5 saving on your £100 Dutch every race doesn't sound very much, in the long term it will be beneficial. Okay, I think that's everything I need to cover in this video. If you have any questions, just give me a shout and I shall endeavour to answer them when I've got the chance. Cheers!